I used to live in a bad area. It was the west end of Newcastle, and at the time it was so bad that it was safer for me and my friends to walk to town rather than go up and get the bus. Gangs of youths would hang around that area and cause trouble. This was early one winter day at around 7 a.m. It had been lightly snowing, and it was about -8 degrees. It was a particularly cold spell at the end of the 1990s. On this day, we heard that the River Tyne had frozen. This was an unusual sight, so we decided to walk along the river to avoid the bus stop. There was snow falling. We were having fun and walking down the riverside path, and generally enjoying the morning walk. We were throwing snowballs at each other and sliding around on the ice, which had formed on the path. Once we reached the river, we saw that it was indeed frozen, and we walked along the side. We were the only people there. There was not another person in sight. The river had jetties, which were big wooden pier-like structures. They went out into the river and were mostly used by fishermen. As we approached one of them, we made the joke about trying to walk across the river ice and how we would probably end up stuck and needing help. At this point, I saw a man under one of the jetties, apparently bending over for something. I said we'd end up stuck there like him. Then we looked closer and noticed the man was not moving. Being young, we assumed it was just a washed-up mannequin from some stag night which ended on the river. But there was something about the situation that was just strange. It was very difficult to get down to where it was, and neither of us wanted to get closer. The skin on it was pure white, and it was wearing what looked like black clothes. We could not see a face, just the body bent over a beam supporting the jetty. Being the 1990s, neither of us could afford phones, so we were not sure what to do. I wanted to phone my mom and get her to come down, so I remembered there was a phone box a little back. I volunteered to run there and make the call. When I arrived at the phone box, I called home to get my mother. She instantly thought we were just trying to get a lift into town and refused to come. That was when I used my very serious voice. She seemed to understand that it was real, and I was not just trying to avoid the snow. I ran back to the jetty, and another man had arrived. He was also concerned that it might be a dead body. None of us wanted to get very close to it. The man had a phone, and he called the police. He requested river police, who by handy coincidence were already in the area, using their boat to break ice on the river. They arrived at around the same time as my mom. She drove a huge 1980s Ford Granada and pulled up alongside us on the river path. She insisted it was just a mannequin, and that she would take us to town. She said we should leave. We were then somehow convinced that she was right, and a little embarrassed for thinking it had been a dead body. The man who called the police also decided to leave and continued his walk. Just as we got into the car, we saw the river police boat approaching in the distance and decided we should at least explain them our mistake. So we waited for them to arrive. They pulled up to the jetty. One of them climbed up the ladder and came to see us. We explained what happened. He laughed and said it was okay. Then he told us they would remove it, and it was no problem. Then we pointed to the mannequin. When he looked over, he instantly became super serious. He got on his radio and summoned the local police and the fire brigade to attend. Suddenly, police appeared from everywhere, and we were taken to one side and interviewed about the situation. At this point, we knew it must have actually been a dead body. The firemen arrived and used inflatable sheets to reach the body. The police told us we could stay and watch, but that it's not like what you see on TV shows. We should maybe consider leaving. He stood with us when we decided to stay and explained what was going on. This is when it escalated fast. The firemen approached the body, and two of them got hold of it, but it was frozen solid to the wooden beam. We thought they would just gently ease it off, but that's not what happened. Two more firemen went down, and they all pulled as hard as they could. There was a huge noise, like a branch snapping, and the body broke in half. Crabs emerged from inside it, falling into the mud below, and the policeman casually said, "That's the sound of them snapping his spine." Then they threw the top of the body into a body bag and started working on the lower half. Another huge snap sound came when they broke his legs. More crabs and river creatures burst out. They then dragged the two parts of the body up onto the path. Then they lined up 3 police rookie recruits right in front of the bags. They made us walk quite far away. Then they opened the bags to show the new recruits what it looked like. What I saw next was like something out of a horror movie. His face had crabs emerging from the eye sockets, and the lips had been totally eaten away. The body was totally bright white, and his hair was gone. One of the policemen threw up. The policeman took our details and asked if we were okay. We were. It all happened so fast that there was no time to process it all. We were later contacted by a reporter who told us the man's name was Jimmy, and he had been due in court for serious criminal charges. The police believed that he had jumped into the river rather than facing a long time in prison. It made the front page of the local paper. I still walk along that same path quite often, all these years later, and I always stop for a while where we found that body. I've never seen anything like that since, but it was certainly an event that made us no longer feel like children, rather adults realizing what the world is really like. My need for experiences and small adventures generally don't get me into any trouble, which is why I've probably never learned not to take any unnecessary risks. That is until this one experience I had while visiting my family back in the suburbs of LA for a weekend. For this small adventure, I decided to walk from my house in Torrance to LAX airport in the dead of night to catch my flight at 6 a.m. back up north where I used to live. This would mean getting up at around midnight and walking for 4 hours through somewhat sketchy parts of LA. Since I wasn't allowed to bring anything weapon-like on the airplane, I couldn't bring anything with me on my walk there. Also, I made sure I didn't tell my family about my long walk because I didn't want to worry them. The walk started out nice and peaceful. For the first hour and a half, I basically didn't encounter anyone except another man who had a suitcase. He looked like he was going to the airport as well, so I just smiled at him and kept moving along. He didn't smile back, but I kind of expected that anyway. About 2.5 hours into my walk, I got away from the nicer suburbs where I lived and transitioned into cities bordering the South Central. For those who don't know, cities near South Central LA get a lot of rap for having a lot of crime, and those were the cities that I started to pass through. I suppose I could have looked up better alternative routes for my nighttime stroll, but like I said, I was more interested in experiencing things rather than being careful. At some point, I passed a pretty lively bar. It wasn't a nice fancy bar like you'd see up in the Sunset District, however. This bar was next to car chop shops, some small industries, and lower-class one-story houses sprinkled in around there. Right when I was about 100 feet away from the bar, I noticed that the people who I thought were just yelling and having a good time were actually trash-talking one another. Right as I passed in front of the rowdy group, a fight broke out. As I passed the fight, about 4 feet from the action, one of the bystanders shouted in my direction, "What's the matter? You lost, boy?" I looked at him briefly and kept my fast pace past the bar. He eyed me intensely. I calculated that there was a 50% chance he was going to follow me and harass me further. Luckily he didn't, though. He clearly knew I didn't belong there. Maybe it was because I'm Asian, and the main population in that area was Hispanic. Another 45 minutes or so passed, and the streets were quiet again. I was in the heart of Hawthorne downtown, and the only activity was the occasional bike rider going down the street, so I generally thought nothing of it. At one point, however, a guy with a black hoodie appeared on the same side of the street that I was on, and he was riding in my direction. I straightened up my posture and kept walking confidently, minding my own business and keeping my head slightly pointed downward as he passed. I couldn't really help it though, and looked up momentarily to glance at him right as he was passing. I was hoping to see him look straight ahead, but that was not the case. He was looking right at me with a stern, mean look on his face. I was relieved to see him pass right by me and continue riding along. I took a sigh of relief and decided to take a quick look behind me to make sure he was continuing onward. But as I did that, I saw him in the middle of a U-turn to come back towards me from behind. I got really nervous and prayed to God he wasn't going to come right up to me. Maybe he just forgot something. As luck would have it, he came up right beside me with his bike, wobbling like he was drunk.
"Hey, can I borrow your phone?"
he said. Without showing any signs of freaking out, I quickly and calmly said, sure. But I knew these scams. You let them borrow your phone, and then they ride off with it. So I asked him for his friend's number, so I could dial it in and put it on speaker. But the guy in the hoodie insisted he dial it. I'm not sure what his exact reasoning was, but either I was naive, or he gave a convincing enough reason for me to let him take my phone and make the call. As he was looking at my home screen and pressing buttons, I saw him reach into his sweater pocket. Without hesitation, I intervened. "Hey, hands where I can see them." That's when he quickly showed the butt end of a shiny silver object that I can only assume was a handgun. Then he said something like,
"I have a gun, so don't fuck with me."
In the midst of the shock, I played it as cool as I could and just asked what he wanted.
"Give me all your money and hand over the backpack."
Not wanting to make a fuss, I complied. I opened up my wallet and handed him a couple of $20 bills I had, and then I handed him my backpack, to which he scanned for valuable items. There weren't many valuable items in there, except a suit blazer. He put my backpack over his shoulder, along with his own backpack.
"Let's go to an ATM to get more money."
My heart dropped, as I knew this situation wasn't going to be over quickly. He intended to drag it on, and he likely wouldn't stop unless someone helped me. I'm not sure if it was plainly compassion, or if I was trying to be tactical to get out of the situation, but I started to communicate with him on a more friendly level. I started asking him why he would do this, and I would be happy to give him money to help him if he needed it. I started asking him about his personal life and about his family. Maybe that triggered him a bit, because he started to get really pissed off and threatened to shoot me if I kept talking. So finally, I shut up and just started walking with him to the nearest ATM. As I was walking, he was riding beside me on his bike. I noticed him wobbling as he rode, like he was on drugs or something. When we got to the ATM at some random bank that was not mine, I noticed that he was barely able to stand up with his bike, and he kept falling. I could have used the opportunity to run away, knowing that he was intoxicated or drugged up, but I didn't think it was a risk worth taking, considering he still had a bike, no one was around, and he also had a gun. I proceeded to withdraw the maximum amount of money for the day, which was $500. During that withdrawal, I saw a police car pass by on the main street. The squad car didn't even slow down or anything. I prayed that the cop was making a U-turn and he would come back and check up on everything, but that didn't happen. As I was withdrawing the cash, I looked up at the camera that's usually attached to ATMs and mouthed the words, "Help me," hoping somebody was seeing the live footage somewhere in the bank. Perhaps there was a night security or something. I didn't know, but I was desperate. After I withdrew the cash, I told him that I couldn't withdraw any more, and I'd reached my daily allowance for ATM withdrawals. He didn't take that for an answer, and proceeded to take me to another ATM just down the street a little further. I had no idea how long this would go on for, but I wanted to get out of there and just make it to the airport. Down the street was a police precinct with another ATM attached to it. I was happy to see this, and thought I would get rescued any moment now. As I approached the ATM, I looked for cameras that I anticipated a police station would have, but I couldn't find any. Again, I entered my code to get to the withdrawal screen. I looked up at the ATM camera and mouthed the words, "Help me," again. I was unable to withdraw any money, as expected. This made the guy very angry, and he told me we were going to a gas station store instead. I thought this would be my ticket out of the situation. Finally, I would have people to help me, and cameras everywhere to see what was happening. However, when we arrived at the nearest gas station further down the road, the storefront was closed, and all transactions would have to be made through a window. He took my credit card and started listing what he wanted to the store teller. As he was facing the window, I saw the gun right in his sweater pocket. I figured that since he wasn't all there, and the gun was clearly exposed, that I had a chance to unarm him and gain control of the situation. But cautious thoughts entered my head that begged the question, what if he had another gun in his backpack, and the one in his pocket was just a decoy? This alone made me not take the risk. As the teller was handing the guy his large purchase with my credit card, I decided to get the teller's attention by again mouthing the words "help me." The teller looked concerned, but gave me a look as if to say, "What do you want me to do about it?" I was shocked to see this. Would he not be able to phone the cops after we left? Approximately 2 hours went by, and this guy kept taking me from gas station to ATM to gas station to ATM, up and down various side streets along the main road. The scariest part of the night, when I thought I was going to die, but also suffer, was when we went to an ATM next to a dollar store to get money out of my credit card account. I had no idea what that even meant, since my credit card is attached to my checking account, which I already withdrew money from, but he insisted that I punch in the 4-digit PIN to make the transaction work. I told him I didn't even know I had a 4-digit PIN for my credit card. He started getting much angrier than usual, and pulled out the gun and aimed it at my knees. Again, he shouted that if I didn't punch in the numbers right, then he was going to shoot my knees off. I was shaking so badly, and I had no idea what to do. So I complied again, and tried 4 random numbers to get anything to happen. Maybe in the back of my mind, I was hoping for an error message, so that I would not be blamed for not getting any money out. At one point, a random customer of the dollar store that the ATM was attached to came out of the sliding doors. But when he saw what was happening, he scrambled back inside, barely being noticed by the guy. I was confident that any moment now, between the many gas stations and the customer, that the police would eventually show up, but alas, it didn't happen, and we kept moving along. Finally, whatever was left of my adrenaline faded away, and I was no longer really scared of what was going on. I was far too exhausted to really care. When we came to the last gas station on the street, the guy wanted me to ask the teller to somehow withdraw money using any of my bank cards. I obviously knew this wasn't going to work, but I at least saw an opportunity. I tried my hand again and mouthed the words "help me" to the teller through the window while negotiating to withdraw money. She automatically knew something was up and quickly said that in order to withdraw any money, the card holder would have to come inside. I knew she was helping me out. As she opened the door to the store, I told the guy I would be back with the money and proceeded to walk in. Not even an inch inside, she slammed the door behind me and locked it as quickly as she could. The guy glared at us through the glass door and pulled his gun out. He pointed it at the door, to which we both jumped out of the way where it was aimed. The guy didn't shoot, however, and ended up running away. I thanked her profusely as she told me to sit down while she called the police. Only a few minutes passed, and 2 squad cars showed up to take my name and fill out a report. I couldn't thank the lady enough for doing what so many others refused to do, and that was to put her life in danger to help me. I soon realized that this lady had 4 children, which seems hard to feed with a gas station teller salary. After things settled down, I came back about a half year later to find her at the gas station again. I gave her $200 and thanked her once again. It was the least I could do after what she did for me. She cried and thanked me. After that incident, I learned to be more cautious about taking unnecessary risks for the sake of experience. Some experiences aren't worth putting your life in jeopardy. I was a 7-year-old girl, a little over 30 years ago, when me and my best friend saw a lady get shot and stabbed. I lived in an apartment in Bellflower, California at the time. The apartment complex was in the shape of a rectangle, with an open courtyard in the middle. It also had a swimming pool, which is where my friend and I were when this incident occurred. There were 3 security doors to enter into the complex itself. The front entrance is made out of thick glass, and you need to use either a key or a code to enter. If you're a visitor, you call the apartment number and get buzzed in. There was a driveway on the side of the complex for the tenants to park their cars. Unfortunately, at this time, there was no security gate in the driveway. Therefore, anyone could walk in off the street into the tenant carports, as well as the other 2 security doors. The other 2 security doors were located on the side of the complex, and the other to the back. The detail of the layout is important as to the line of sight that my friend and I had to the lady who was attacked. You could not see the courtyard from the front glass door because of the privacy garden wall blocking the view. However, you could see the middle of the pool from the side security door, and that's where this incident occurred. As I said, my friend and I were swimming in the pool. My friend's father was watching us while sitting on a pool chair reading a book. He was not in view of the side security door, but my friend and I were when a lady, I'm sorry I can't remember her name, she walked up to the security door. We knew her because she was a tenant in the complex. She was a nurse, and she must have just gotten off her shift because she was still in her scrubs. She was a black woman in her mid to late 30s. She was very nice, and I believe she lived alone at the time. My friend and I called out a hello to her, and she said hello back. She was getting her keys so she could open the security door and come into the complex. We were just hanging onto the side of the pool, watching her, when 2 men walked up to her. We didn't quite hear what was said, but I do remember hearing her shout out no. The 2 men seemed to be a bit young, probably late teens or early 20s. One of the men was black with a fade haircut, and the other one was either white or light-skinned and had a bit of an afro. Their race and hairstyle is all I can remember of them. Then I remember seeing one of the men pull out a gun and shoot her. Then the other man pulled out a knife and stabbed her. She collapsed onto the ground, crying out. I don't know if my friend and I made a sound or what, but as we hung onto the side of the pool in shock, the 2 men turned their heads towards us. Immediately, my friend and I ducked down into the water of the pool. She grabbed my hand, and then we swam towards the shallow end. That way we would be out of view from the side door. My friend's father had heard the gunshot, but he was on the other side of the pool. He would have to cross to the side door entrance to get to his apartment and call 911. He had to wait a few minutes to ensure the men did not enter. They now had the lady's purse and keys, and they could get inside of the complex if they chose to. Once my friend's father knew they were not coming inside, he told us to stay in the pool, and if they came in, to duck down under the water. He then ran to their apartment and dialed 911. I started to get out of the pool, but my friend pulled me back in, asking what I was doing. I told her I wanted to see if the lady was okay, but my friend told me to stay, otherwise I would get hurt too. We were both crying, and so worried for the lady. I can't remember much after this, because I tend to lose some memories of traumatic experiences when I was younger. That's due to some trauma I had gone through as a child. I do remember some things though, and as I get older, I tend to have some flashbacks occasionally. My friend's father came back out and said that the police and an ambulance were on their way. Then he told my friend and I to get into the apartment. My friend's mother was there, so she took care of us while my friend's father went back to check on the lady. I can't say for sure whether or not we were questioned by the police. I've talked to my friend about this, and she has a hard time remembering this as well. She actually completely forgot until I asked her about it after remembering it myself. I do remember being told, though, that the lady did actually survive. Thank God. But she never went back to that apartment complex again. No surprise there. While the lady recovered in the hospital, her family members came and removed everything from her apartment. That was the last straw for the tenants. From what my parents told me, there were complaints about the safety of the carports and the complex itself, because there was no security gate at the driveway. The tenants requested to have a gate installed, but the complex owner refused. However, after this incident, the owner installed a security gate to the driveway, and the tenants had gate openers they could use, kind of like garage door openers. Since this was a traumatic event for my friend and I can't even imagine how traumatizing it was for that lady who was attacked. We didn't live in the safest of neighborhoods, but we didn't have very many incidents like this that I can remember. I do remember having nightmares a few times after witnessing this. I would dream that the two men actually came into the complex and tried to kill my friend and I. Not only am I glad that the lady survived, but that my friend and her father were not hurt by those men. I don't know what we could have done if they did manage to get inside. We were only children, but maybe that could be why they didn't come inside. Or it could have been because they did this in the middle of the day, where anyone could see. I don't know what happened to those men. I don't know if they were found and brought to justice. They could have been, and the adults just decided not to say anything to us about it, so my friend and I wouldn't be afraid. However, I'm just glad I never had to see them again. I'm a 19-year-old female, and I live in a student house in a very rough area. The house is very small, so one of the bedrooms is by the front door downstairs, and the other two are upstairs. There are 5 of us in total, a couple in the downstairs room, our housemate James, and finally myself and my partner. To give some context, I'm quite paranoid. My dad was raised in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and would often share stories about his experiences. Obviously, he only wanted to teach us how to be safe, but these stories were a lot to take in at such a young age, and definitely contributed to my paranoia. I struggled to sleep, so I decided to stand in our backyard and have a quick smoke. I checked that the gate to our yard was locked, so no one from the alley could get in, and then I went back inside. No one could climb the walls, because the top of them was covered in shattered glass and barbed wire. Fast forward a couple hours, and I had a fairly bad migraine, so both my boyfriend and I decided to get some sleep. He fell asleep before me, and I sat up restless. I heard the normal sounds of people walking around the house, going in and out of rooms downstairs. I thought it was either my roommates or my migraine making me confused. I thought nothing of it, and kept trying to go to sleep. It felt like hours, but I'd only been asleep for about half an hour before I woke up to a hammering at my bedroom door. Embarrassingly, I screamed and looked at my boyfriend, who was now wide awake. "Calm down. You're fine," he reassured me, with a startled look on his face. I figured it was just a nightmare, because it's a pretty common occurrence for me to have those, with all the stories my dad told me. It was until I heard James's muffled screams outside my door. He said that we should call the police. My partner shouted back to ask what he was saying. He then said, "There's some guy in my bed. Call the police now." He stopped shouting through to us and began screaming at the man in his room. As I mentioned, I'm pretty cautious, and I often think about the chances of something like this happening, so our room was locked at night, and no one else in the house locked their doors. I got on the phone with 999 and said there was a break-in. Still half asleep and on the verge of a panic attack, I relayed as much as I could while my partner got changed. The police response time was amazing. They got there in 10 minutes, all while we stood watching James scream from the hallway. The guy in his room was clearly off his head on something. His speech was slurred, and he just kept saying,
"I'm Nathan, and if I want to kick off, I'll kick off. And that's what I'm gonna do right now."
Honestly, I was expecting him to pull a knife on James. It's that kind of area, or seriously injure someone. Luckily, the police arrived before that could happen. The guy had his jeans on backwards, and he was swaying back and forth, shirtless. He had a nightclub wristband on, and a lot of dried, bloody scratches down his chest. The police took him away after 10 minutes of trying to talk some sense into him. When they left, we got to ask James what actually happened. He told us he woke up and felt something behind him. He turned around and saw this very dark silhouette of a man lying in his bed. He pushed him to the floor and jumped over him to get out. That's when he started screaming. The guy was completely naked beside James in his bed until James woke up. He screamed until the guy got some clothes on. I know it's not the most terrifying story in the world, considering it was just some crackhead, but I can assure you, being woken up like that at 4 in the morning was terrifying. I dread to think of how horrified James was. To make things worse, one of the people downstairs thought they heard noises and also assumed it was one of us, so he locked the front door and the back doors to make sure no one could get in. How ironic. It's been 5 hours, and I'm still jumping at every sound. Always double check that you've locked all your doors. I used to do food deliveries for Uber. Most of the time it was easy, just drop off the food and then be on my way. But one night, things got a whole lot scarier. I knew my city really well, because I previously did passenger rides for Uber. I switched to deliveries though, because I had some crazy people that I would rather not deal with. Ironically, the worst thing that ever happened to me was after I switched to doing deliveries. It was a Thursday night at around 9 p.m. I started at 7, so there was still a long night ahead of me. I got an order for an apartment building in a rough part of town. I'd been there before, and every time I went through that area, it seemed like something happened. One time I stopped at a red light, and some random guy tried to open my door. Luckily I had it locked. As soon as he realized it was locked, he ran away before I even got a good look at him. I guess he was hoping to get lucky and catch someone who hadn't locked their door. Another time I was driving through there, and I saw a man lying still in the middle of the road. I stopped in front of him and called the police. It turned out that he had been mugged and badly beaten, and then collapsed in the middle of the road. Fortunately he survived, but I don't think they ever caught the guys who attacked him. The street was quiet on the road that night, and I didn't see anything troubling yet. I was following my GPS and keeping an eye out for the building. When I got there, it was dark with just a few windows lit up. It was a smaller building, 3 stories, red brick, and probably built in the 1960s if I had to guess. I parked my car and headed over with my customer's order in hand. The building was in rough shape. There was at least one broken window that I could see, and it was boarded up. There was also a lot of graffiti. As I approached the door, I realized that it was open a crack. Usually I would have to buzz someone to get in, but this building was so run down that it wasn't necessary. Most of the lights in the hallway were burned out. Of the few remaining bulbs, 1 or 2 of them were flickering. It was an eerie place to be. I walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor, and each step I took caused a loud creak. The order was for apartment 302, and when I reached the 3rd floor, I stepped out into the hallway. It was even darker up there. The only light was coming from the exit sign at the end of the hall. I walked down, counting the apartment numbers. There were only 4 apartments per floor. One of the doors was wide open, and it looked like it was abandoned or not suitable for a tenant. I took a peek in, and it was absolutely trashed. All I wanted was to get out of there, though, so I continued to number 302. I knocked on the door, and a young guy opened it. He wasn't particularly friendly, but my expectations were low. I gave him the food, and he closed the door. It was actually quite a relief. I was expecting some kind of a drug dealer or gangster, but the guy was pretty normal. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it. 2 sharp bangs, like a firework, but I was not naive enough to think that that's what it was. I knew it was a gunshot, and it came from the end of the hall. Then I heard a door creak open. It was the last door in the hallway, the one just past the one where I made the delivery. A man stepped out, his face shadowed in the dim light. He looked at me and shouted,
What did you hear?
My breath caught in my throat, and I didn't know what he was capable of. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I looked back, and the man was chasing me. I flew down the stairs, and out the front door of the building. I looked back one more time, and the man was still on my tail. When I got to my car, I got in and locked the door. Before I could start it, the man came out and started banging on the window. I fired up the engine and sped away. I didn't stop until I was miles away, in a well-lit part of town. I pulled over and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Then I called the police, told them what happened, about the gunshots, and the man in the hallway. They told me they'd check it out. I sat in my car, waiting for what felt like hours. Finally, an officer approached me. We went to the building, and I watched from a distance. I couldn't see much, just the flashing lights reflecting off the windows. It felt like a movie, but I knew it was all too real. When they finally came out, they had the man in handcuffs and another one on a stretcher. They put him in the back of a squad car, and I let out a sigh of relief. The other man was taken to the hospital. I'm still not sure of the exact details, but there was a shooting in that building while I was there. The victim survived, but lost a lot of blood before help arrived. The neighborhood where I used to live wasn't the nicest. It had its share of rough areas, and there was some gang activity. Me and my friends always looked out for each other, though. I lived in an apartment building that was part of a large complex. People there were poor, but we managed to have a good time anyway. My two best friends lived in the same building as me. Mark was on the floor below me, and my friend Carlos was on the ground floor with his mom and dad. Like I said, it wasn't the best neighborhood, and there were many closed storefronts when you walked down most of the streets. Also, there were several abandoned buildings in the area. There was an abandoned mall and a few industrial buildings that hadn't been opened since before I lived there. The mall was a few blocks away from our complex. We'd snuck into it before, but recently they put up a barbed wire fence, so me and my friends stayed out. One day, we decided to explore one of the buildings that was about a 20-minute bike ride away from our home. It was a Saturday night, and the three of us were just hanging out at a local park, talking and smoking. When it was dark, Carlos suggested that we head over to the building and check it out. Mark and I agreed, so we got on our bikes. When we got to the building, we stashed our bikes behind a nearby bush. It was 3 stories, with mostly boarded up windows. There was a fence around it, but it was just one of those temporary metal fences that don't really join together. We found a gap and slipped inside. The air was musty and stale. It smelled like old wood and dust. We walked around for a bit, and then Carlos wanted to check out the upstairs. When we got to the staircase, though, there was no way I was going up. It didn't look safe. The stairs were made of wood, and there must have been half of them missing. Rusty nails stuck out everywhere. When I refused, Carlos and Mark agreed, and we went back to one of the rooms on the ground level. Then we lit up a cigarette and drank some beers that I brought. That's when we heard voices outside. I signaled for Mark and Carlos to be quiet. We inched closer to the window and peeked out. There was a group of 5 guys, dressed in dark clothes. I recognized one of them, and he was a known gang member in our area. We knew to stay away from those kinds of people, and it usually wasn't a problem for us. We didn't want to get caught alone with them, though. I thought they might think we were following them, or spying. If they got that idea, then we could be in real trouble. We all knew we had to get out of there, but going back meant going really close to where that group was. Because of the layout of the building and the area surrounding it, we would have to go past them to get out. We got up and made our way through one of the side doors. I looked around the corner of the building and saw that they were still there, gathered in a circle. It looked like they didn't see us, not yet anyway. I quietly suggested to my friends that we should wait for the guys to move on. Carlos disagreed because he thought they might try to enter the building, which would lead them right to where we were. He thought our best chance was to make a run for it. It was dark, so at least we had that on our side. Mark agreed with Carlos, and I reluctantly went along with their plan to make a run for it. Carlos counted down from 5, and then we sprinted for the gap in the fence. It was all a blur to me. Somehow, it was both the longest and quickest 30 seconds of my life. We made it out of there, but not before being seen. I looked back and locked eyes with one of the gang members. When I did that, he called out,
"I know you, kid."
That simple sentence chilled me to the bone. We may have made it out in one piece, but I knew this would not be the end of it. On Wednesday of the following week, I was walking home from school alone. When I was just a block away from my building, I was cornered by 3 older guys. One of them was the gang member that I recognized from the other night. They didn't say a word to me, but they didn't need to. I knew what was happening. Out of nowhere, I was hit with a punch. I dropped to the ground and covered my head. There was no sense in fighting back. I took a few more hits when I was on the ground, but eventually they stopped. I rolled over to my back and saw them walking away. One of them turned around and said something like,
"Tell anyone, and you're done."
Might have cleaned up the language on that one a bit, but it was something along those lines. When I got home, I texted Mark and Carlos to see if they were okay. Lucky for them, it was just me. I think that's because I was the only one who they recognized. I never bothered to tell anyone what happened. When my mom asked me about the bruises, I lied to her and told her that I got into a fight at school. I think she could tell I was lying though. In any case, that was pretty much the end of it. I kept to myself after that and never had any other trouble. It does make me wonder though, what the hell were those guys doing in there that they were so eager to protect? I didn't see anything interesting, just some guys standing around talking. I guess they were trespassing, same as us, but that's hardly the crime of the century. I think we walked into something a little more serious, but I don't think we'll ever know what it was. To start out, I'm a 19-year-old female in LA County, California. The town I'm from is very notorious for everything from gang violence to trafficking to kidnapping, so being alone for anyone is considered really dangerous. Despite this fact, I'm somewhat street smart and cautious, so I don't worry too much about it. I've had a few bad encounters, but most were just old men hitting on me in trucks or staring at me as they passed, so this is one of the closest and probably the scariest one for me. For a little context, I'm a little on the heavier side, and decided it would be nice if I tried to get back into shape. I started going on runs, or even just walks. I got dressed and poured some water for when I came home. I left my complex door open since I was leaving without my keys. Then I left and headed for the park. There are a few ways to get there, because it's all connected, but I decided to go the long way. That way I could get warmed up and try to get into a groove. When I got to the park, I noticed right away that there were two men sitting in a black semi-tinted car. It was in front of the main play structure, and right where I was going to do laps. I felt kind of weird about it, but I remembered that a lot of people parked in random spots for Pokemon Go, so I just chalked it up to that. For the laps, I wanted to walk 3 and jog 2. After 3 sets of this, I looked over to notice that the guys in the car were still sitting there staring at me. They had their phones out, almost as if to look busy. My gut told me something wasn't right about this, but again, I shrugged it off and continued my workout. I was getting a little out of breath on my 4th set, and I started to slow down. That's when I saw one of the men get out of the car and awkwardly walk to a blue van that I never noticed before. It was right in front of them. When he opened the door, I swear to God, I saw a rag, rope, and tape on the seat. Then I saw him fumbling with them, as if to get ready for something. He looked over his shoulder to see me staring at him. He then jumped into the back seat, like he was hiding from me. My mind was screaming at me to leave, so I went the long way back. I did that not only to make sure they weren't following me, but also because their cars were blocking my way. I looked back to check, and they were both gone, so I hurried back home to my apartment building, only to see them at the end of my street when I finally reached it. They spotted me and made a U-turn coming down my street towards me and my apartment. I sprinted to my gate, and just as soon as I got in, they pulled over and got out. By some miracle, they gave up and sped away, leaving me terrified. Later I told my boyfriend what happened, but only what happened at the park. He told me to call the non-emergency tip line to let them know, but I didn't want to out of fear of being called dramatic. That was this morning, and I finally decided to call them 10 minutes ago. However, just as I feared, they called me stupid even after I told them what happened outside my apartment. They said they couldn't do anything for me, and then they hung up. Just for everyone who might hear this, follow your gut, and please stay safe. This happened to 2 very good friends of mine, but I was there helping them through it every step of the way. I asked their permission before posting, of course. All names have been changed. In 2014, I moved to my state's capital to live with my dad, so I could save some money before I moved out of the country. I needed a job that wouldn't be too physically taxing, because I was recovering from surgery on my shoulder. I found a job that was perfect. I was a street canvasser. I was one of those people who stands outside and waves you down, so you'll donate money to the ACLU, SPLC, or any other campaign we might be working on. The causes I was working to fundraise for were important, and I really enjoyed the versatility, the changing environment, and the friends I made. It was through this job that I met Monica and Terry. Monica worked with me and was married to Terry. We became very fast friends and would spend several nights a week together, just enjoying each other's company. We had a fourth friend in the mix, Rory, who would join us at our hangouts. He worked with Monica and me. We had all been pretty close friends for about 6 months when Rory was kicked out of his dad's house. He told us it was because his dad was a recovering alcoholic and addict. Rory also told us that his dad thought he wasn't respecting his house rules of no drinking. Monica and Terry agreed to let him stay with them until he could find a place of his own. They lived in a one-bedroom apartment, so we slept on a mattress on the floor in their living room. It was great having my 3 closest friends all living in the same place. I would head over to theirs after work. I had gotten a much better paying job at this time, but we would still have dinner, drink, play games, or whatever. We even built a blanket fort to play cards in once. We were in our 20s and 30s at the time, and to be honest, I would still do the same today. After about a month or 2 of Rory living with them, he was fired from the street canvassing job. We were fuzzy on the actual details, but it wasn't uncommon to be fired from there. If you didn't meet your fundraising quota 2 weeks in a row, you were let go, so we didn't push too much to find everything out. Rory did his best during this time to contribute as much as possible as he was staying with Terry and Monica. He would clean the apartment, cook dinner, buy them gifts, check the mail. It was an apartment complex where the mailboxes were a little out of the way. He would also download movies and TV shows that they wanted to watch. He honestly seemed like the ideal housemate. That was until one day, Monica and Terry found a little plastic bag on the floor of their bathroom. In that bag was some sort of illicit drug. It was either meth or crack. We don't know. We have no issues with recreational drug use. Who doesn't enjoy a joint now and again? But meth is pushing it a little far. Monica and Terry were very understanding and kind when they confronted him. They simply asked him to make certain that he doesn't leave anything around, since their cats love to eat plastic, and if they ate that, it would probably kill them. Rory apologized and promised to be more careful. This was the first red flag, and further evidence for why his father kicked him out. It wasn't just alcohol, it was also drugs. Then a few weeks later, Monica and Terry called me during my lunch break. They said, "We feel like there's something you should know, since we're all such good friends." Terry got a call about a credit card he recently applied for, only he didn't. We finally got them to tell us who the authorized user was on the card, and it was Rory. Monica didn't waste any time, getting straight to the point. "Seriously?" I said. I was utterly shocked that Rory, our Rory, opened a credit card in their name. They then told me that this was the second credit card company to call. The other one refused to tell them who the authorized user was. Then she told me that he borrowed their camera, which still had their honeymoon pictures on it. He hadn't been home in 2 days. We texted him asking him when he would be back, and he said he'd be back tomorrow. At that point, this was all the information we needed. I went back to work, and I couldn't shake the thought of Rory quite literally stealing their identity. I was heartbroken for them and angry at him. Why would he do this to 2 generous good people who opened their home to him? Monica and Terry had obviously decided to kick him out. I told them that since this really had nothing to do with me, I would wait for him to return and leave the moment he walked in. I waited in my car for them to finish their conversation with Rory, and they texted me when he left. Then I went straight back in. They were clearly and understandably upset, hurt, and angry. I hoped that this would be the end of it, but we'd only scratched the surface. The tendrils of Rory's filthy scheming and thieving actions did not stop with the 2 credit cards. The night they kicked him out, he was arrested for breaking into the office building where we had all worked. He was too high to get in and out fast enough, so the police caught him easily, and he was sent straight to jail. Monica and Terry began investigating the lengths to which he had gone in stealing from them. It turned out that when he was checking the mail, he was stealing the credit card applications sent to them and filling them out. When all was said and done, he had attempted to open 15 credit cards in their name. He succeeded in receiving several. One of them was a Macy's card, and he purchased a diamond ring so he could hawk it. They were receiving Amazon packages every day for about a week after he'd left. It was all purchased under Terry's name, with a credit card he didn't know about. He had left everything he owned behind in their apartment, so I looked up property laws for our estate. After 2 weeks, if the tenant did not come to reclaim his property, the landlord could claim it as their own, and do with it what they pleased, so we waited for 2 weeks. Remember all the cleaning he did for them? Well, once the 2 weeks were up, they opened the boxes next to his mattress. They discovered he had helped himself to Monica's birth certificate, her social security card, and a plethora of other things that he wanted for himself. We found evidence of other scams he had pulled, other people's private information, and so much more. He also left behind his Xbox, his TV, and some other gadgets. Terry and Monica kept what they wanted, and sold what they didn't. He apparently had a storage unit under an alias that we suspected had a ton of stolen loot in it, but we were unable to gain access to that. It also turned out that the reason he was fired was because he was forging donations from people. If someone wanted to donate $10, he would change the 1 to a 4, or any other way he could scam more money. We earned a bonus once we surpassed a goal that was a percentage of the overage. He would even take his canvas shirt and clipboard home and canvas out of hours, accepting cash donations and people's credit card information for himself. Honestly, there's so much more to this story that I don't have the time or energy to write out. There's a lot more that came to light about Rory in the following months. Things he did, what his life was really like, etc. Monica and Terry reported it all to the police and handed over all the evidence they had, but I'm not so sure anything really came of it. The entirety of it all was truly shocking, eye-opening, and infuriating. We never heard from Rory again after the night Monica and Terry kicked him out. He never tried to get his things back, never apologized, nothing. I know this is a very anticlimactic ending, but it's just how it ended. There's no real closure for any of us involved, but especially Monica and Terry. The three of us have remained good friends, despite time and distance. I lived outside the US for nearly 5 years, and as bad as this all was, I would say it definitely brought us closer together. I also can't stress enough what great people these two are. Even now, they still help their friends out whenever they can. They still let their friends crash on the sofa for months at a time, if need be. I moved to a new city about 2 years ago, after the end of a bad relationship. It was both exciting and nerve-wracking for me. I needed a fresh start, and I found a short-term rental room to stay in until I got settled. It was a small room in the basement of a house. It wasn't much, but it was close to the subway and it was cheap. Not a bad place to start. Within a few weeks, I landed a job as a server at a nearby restaurant. The work was hectic, but I was happy to be working at all. I got along very well with my coworkers. Claire was one of the bartenders, and we hit it off immediately. We had only known each other for about a week when the topic of my living situation came up. Coincidentally, Claire had a spare room in her apartment that had just become available. She was eager to find someone to move in because she couldn't afford the place on her own. It seemed like the perfect solution for my housing situation. She offered it to me right away. I thought about it for about a day, and then the next time I was at work, I told Claire that I would take it. My 1 month at my current place was almost up, so the timing was also great. I moved in with Claire the following night. I was excited to build our friendship and finally feel at home again. The apartment was great. It was in an old historic building. I guess it used to be a house, or a mansion would be more accurate. It was split up into 6 apartments, and ours was half of the second floor. The ceilings were high, and the walls were beautiful sculpted wood. I had never lived anywhere like that before. Things were great for the first few days. We worked similar hours, so we would usually make dinner together. I felt that a good friendship had begun. However, There was one person in the equation that made me uneasy: Claire's boyfriend, Tim. From the moment I met Tim, I sensed something off about him. He seemed overly friendly and flirtatious when Claire wasn't around. I thought at first that he was just trying to be nice and welcoming, so I didn't say anything. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, actually. He really did worry me, though. As the days went by, Tim's advances towards me became more persistent and obvious. Despite my clear rejections, he didn't back down. At one point he tried to hug me, but I totally rejected him. I could tell he was angry, but I didn't care. I needed to make a statement, and that was my way of doing it. After that, I avoided any encounters with Tim and hoped he would get the message to leave me alone. I thought everything was fine, but the next day, Claire came to me. Her eyes were filled with tears. Tim had fed her a twisted version of the events, claiming I had been the one pursuing him. I was taken aback, shocked that Tim had manipulated the truth to turn Claire against me. I denied the accusations vehemently, hoping that Claire would see through Tim's lies. But by the end of our conversation, I could tell that she didn't believe me. Our friendship was definitely on the rocks, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't afford to move out, so I simply kept my distance from Claire as much as possible. It was hard though, because we lived and worked together, and like I said, we worked similar shifts, so we were home at the same time very often. It was awkward for the next week. I was hoping things would blow over though. One day, I was feeling sick. I was feeling really nauseous and had a giant headache. I called in sick for work and slept all day, but it got worse. The next night I was up vomiting, and I felt very dizzy. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced. After that, I visited the doctor, hoping for some answers. After describing my symptoms, the doctor recommended several tests. The results were both shocking and terrifying. I tested positive for antifreeze poisoning. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, and I knew that Claire or Tim was responsible. I figured they were slipping it into my orange juice, or something else. It was really scary. I knew I could never go back to that place, so I went to the police instead. However, without concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. Claire denied it, and I'm sure she destroyed any evidence. I still think they should have been able to prove that she bought the stuff at some point. I guess there wasn't enough evidence to get a warrant for her credit cards or anything. I moved out of Claire's apartment as quickly as I could. I moved back into the basement room where I lived before. Quitting my job was the next step, despite the financial strain it would cause. I could barely afford to do this, but what other choice was there? I eventually found a new job and a new place, and things were looking up. It was a terrifying experience, and luckily, I've never seen Claire or Tim again. I heard Claire was fired from the restaurant not long after. I'm not sure if it had anything to do with what she did to me. I told some of our coworkers what happened between us, so I'm not sure if some people were uncomfortable being around her. If I really wanted to, I could probably find out, but to be honest, I really don't want anything to do with her. I don't even want to know. This happened in my first year at college. I lived in the on-campus residence for my first year. My building was old, but not in a good way. I think it was from the 1960s, so it was old enough to be a little run down, but not old enough to have much character. I didn't mind though. It was just exciting to be out of my parents' house. Everyone on my floor had a roommate. My roommate, Tarek, seemed a bit off from the start. He had a distant gaze, he rarely spoke, and didn't seem to have any interest in getting to know me. I tried to include him as much as possible, but it was useless. I tried to brush it off as mere quirks, but as the weeks went by, strange things began to happen. I'll just give a quick layout of our room. It was a long room, with the door at one end and a window at the other. My bed was next to the door, and Tarek's bed was next to the window. We both had a full-size desk next to our beds, so there was a fair distance between us when we were sleeping. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps pacing around the room. I rolled over, and saw that Tarek was up pacing back and forth in our room. I pretended to be sleeping because I was too scared to say anything. Another night, I heard Tarek whispering to himself. His voice was filled with an eerie intensity. I didn't know what he was saying, or if it was just nonsense. I thought he might be talking in his sleep. That would be the best case scenario anyway. It didn't seem like that, though. I noticed right away that Tarek was into some weird witchcraft type stuff. He had several books on that kind of thing around the room. I wasn't too uncomfortable about it at first, but after the other things, it seemed even more creepy. Things went on like this for another month. I can't tell you how uncomfortable it was. I don't think we exchanged more than a few words the entire time. It came to an end in a really weird way. Tarek was actually kicked out of residence. It turned out that he had several large knives that were not allowed in our dorm. I never saw them, so I was as shocked as anyone. I still don't know how he got caught. I never told, but I guess someone saw him with those giant knives and got freaked out. I don't think I would have slept a wink if I knew he was there with an arsenal of weapons in addition to everything else. The good news is that he was never replaced. I was the only one on my floor that year without a roommate. That had its ups and downs, but I can't complain. A lot of my friends were jealous. Nobody was jealous, though, when Tarek was around. In my early 20s, I shared an apartment with two other women, Josie and Sarah. It was a second-floor walk-up with 3 bedrooms and a nice big living room area. Life was fun, and we enjoyed our time together in the city. I had just moved in, having found the place online. Therefore, I didn't know them very well yet. We were getting along quite well, though. However, there was something creepy about Josie's boyfriend, Darren. He always made me feel uncomfortable with his slick and arrogant demeanor. I was relieved when he stopped coming over, and I assumed they had broken up. Since Josie and I weren't very close, I didn't ask her about it right away. She did eventually mention that they'd broken up, though. I didn't ask for any more details, and she didn't elaborate. As time passed, Josie and I became closer. About a month passed, and we started talking about our past relationships. Josie opened up about Darren. It turned out he had been arrested for robbing a store with a fake gun. He was also involved with drug dealing. I was shocked to hear that, even though I didn't like the guy. I wondered how much Josie knew about that when they were together. I was actually pretty disturbed that she let that guy into our home, if she knew what he was up to. I didn't press the issue, though. It was over and done. That's what I thought at the time, anyway. I put Darren out of my mind, and I didn't think of him for a while. One evening, while Josie and Sarah were out, I was alone in the apartment. I decided to watch a movie. I sat down on the couch with a blanket and a bowl of popcorn, and just enjoyed my time alone. As the movie played, I heard a faint knocking sound coming from somewhere in the apartment. My heart started racing, and I paused the movie to listen more carefully. The knocking grew louder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Gathering my courage, I followed the sound to Josie's room. The door was slightly ajar, and the knocking seemed to be coming from inside. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing in the room, was Darren. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was him. I recognized his jacket and his baggy pants. He had his back facing me, and his head was buried in the closet. He seemed to be looking for something, or just digging around. As soon as I saw him, I let out a scream. I immediately regretted it, because he turned around and saw me. I slammed the door shut and burst out the front door of the apartment. I called the police first, then I called Josie. When the police arrived, Darren was gone. Not surprising at all. I had no idea how he got in. The window was too high to climb, so I figured that he was there the whole time, probably for hours while I thought I was alone. When Josie finally came home, the truth behind the whole thing was revealed. She had started seeing Darren again, and he was in her room because she let him in the night before. He was in there the whole time while I thought I was alone. I had no idea he was there. I felt betrayed by my new friend. She knowingly exposed me to a dangerous person. She left me alone with that guy without any warning. I was beyond furious over it. I moved out not long after and never talked to Josie again. I moved out of my parents' house when I was 18 years old. I had just graduated from high school and I wanted to try something new. That's why I decided to move out of my hometown to a bigger city. I didn't have enough to afford my own place, so I was looking for a roommate. I would check Craigslist and Facebook every day when I was planning the move. There was a post on Facebook that looked good. It was for a room in a 2-bedroom house. My future roommate would be Kyle, who was the owner of the place, and he was in his late 20s. Included in the post were only 3 pictures. One of them was of the living room, which looked amazing. There was a large couch, and it looked really fancy. The rest of the room was nicely decorated. The other 2 photos were just of an empty bedroom that looked pretty basic. That was to be expected. It was up to me to make the place look like home. After a few messages back and forth, we decided to become roommates. It was a big leap for me, but I was excited to move out, and Kyle seemed decent enough in our online exchanges. Since I was in a different city, which was pretty far away, I didn't see the place in person before moving in. Before I moved in, Kyle sent me a list of house rules. It was just basic stuff for the most part. Clean up after yourself, and don't go into his room. Not much else. When I arrived, Kyle was there to welcome me. He was a tall, thin guy, and he had really bad posture. He was constantly hunched over and had a really strange smile on his face, which made me feel uneasy right from the start. As soon as I moved in, Kyle disappeared into his room, and I didn't see him again that day. It was a really lonely feeling being there. I was in an unfamiliar place, and other than one good friend, I didn't know anybody in the city. One thing that immediately struck me was that the picture from Facebook did not match up to anything in the actual house. Since I didn't have any other options though, I let it go. I figured he had put it there to make the place look better. It wasn't that bad in real life, but I bet all the furniture came from a thrift store. Not that that bothered me or anything. As the days went by, Kyle stayed in his room most of the time. I knew that he worked from home, but the silence that emanated from his room seemed more and more like seclusion rather than productivity. Occasionally I'd hear hushed murmurs, as if he were talking to himself, but it was infrequent. I would see him occasionally in the kitchen, but that was really it. I started to wonder what he was doing in his room that whole time. He was there when I left for work, and he was there when I came back. Over the next few weeks, I saw less and less of Kyle. Eventually, I realized I hadn't seen him for days. Not in the kitchen making food. I didn't even see or hear him going to the bathroom. It was very strange, and he wasn't even answering his phone. I didn't want to do it, but I decided I had to check on him. What if he needed help? I had to find out. I approached his door, feeling very nervous. There was no telling what I might find in that room. Standing in front of the door, I decided to knock first. My fist pounded on the door twice. Then I took a step back and waited. There was not a sound from the other side of the door, and I was listening carefully. Next, I tried to turn the doorknob, but it was locked. The interior doors just had those locks that were easy enough to open, with anything thin enough to poke in. I found a wooden skewer in the kitchen, and used that to unlock the door. I cautiously pushed it open. The room was dark and the curtains were drawn. The air was stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in days. Kyle's bed was neatly made, his desk cluttered with papers, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he disappeared into thin air. I stood there in the doorway for a minute, then I closed the door and went back to my room. What was I supposed to do? My roommate disappeared without a trace. Was he a missing person, or just out for whatever reason? I decided not to call the police. The next night, when I was in bed, I heard the front door creak open. Heavy footsteps pounded through the hallway. I heard them approaching my room. The door swung open, and I saw Kyle rush towards me. Before I knew it, he was leaning over my bed, and he had a knife to my throat.
What the hell are you doing in my room?
He bellowed. I didn't answer. I couldn't squeeze out a word. The knife pressed harder against my skin.
Stay the hell out of my room,
he barked. I finally managed to speak, and I said that I was sorry. I couldn't see his face because it was too dark, but I knew he was seriously pissed.
What did you see?
Kyle shouted. I didn't see anything. I just opened the door then left, I tried to explain. As soon as I said that, he turned around and stomped out of my room and then out the front door of the house. After he was gone, I laid there in bed, not daring to sleep. The next day, Kyle was still gone. I walked around the house, and eventually, I found a small camera in the kitchen hidden behind the coffee maker. I poked around a bit more and found one in the hallway as well. I think that's how he knew I went into his room. There was probably a camera in there as well, probably connected to his phone. When I found that, I knew I needed to leave, as if it wasn't obvious enough already. I packed up what I could and called my parents. My mom was happy that I was coming home anyway. They picked me up late that evening, and we stayed in a motel that night. When I finally got back to my parents' house, I was relieved. I had to leave my job in the city, but it was worth it. Something about this experience made me feel like I was not ready to move out yet. I still wonder why Kyle was so concerned about his room. The need for privacy is understandable, but the way he reacted made me think that he was up to something, like there was something to hide in his room. He was seriously unhinged in the way he threatened me with that knife, though. We did end up filing a police report, but never heard anything back, and it's been over 5 years now. I still don't know exactly what Kyle was up to. I didn't stay long enough to know for sure. It wasn't worth it to be around that guy any longer. When I was about 18 years old, I made some bad decisions and was fighting with my mom a lot. I decided to move out of her house and moved in with this guy who I was seeing. He was kind of shady and had some kind of shady friends, but I was the age where I thought I knew everything and didn't listen to anyone. We had to move out of our place where we were staying. A guy my boyfriend had worked with offered to let us stay at his place. We moved in with the guy, and at the time, we didn't have a car, and I wasn't working. My boyfriend was looking for a job. Because the guy we were staying with worked nights, he was there all the time during the day. Therefore, I was all alone with him, since my boyfriend was out looking for work. It was just me and that guy. He was a drunk, but not an angry drunk or anything. Just one of those guys that would sit around and drink all the time, and didn't really do anything, so no big deal. He was a little creepy, and stared at me a lot, but I was young and stupid, and didn't think much of that either. The place we were living in was a 2-bedroom trailer, but the kind that didn't have real doors. Instead, it had these plastic curtain-type doors that didn't close all the way. The guy's bedroom was the only room with a real door. All the rest of them were those weird curtain-type things. That's important a little later. For the first couple of days, everything was cool. The guy shared his beer with us, and pretty much left us alone. The first day that my boyfriend went to look for work, I was alone with the guy. I was sitting in the living room, just hanging out playing solitaire with a deck of cards and listening to the radio. The guy came out of his bedroom and started staring at me again. I was a little creeped out, but figured whatever. He seemed harmless enough, so I pretty much ignored him. He sat there for about an hour, just drinking beer and staring at me, and then said that he was going to take a nap. The next thing I heard, he was making disturbing noises that I would rather not describe in detail. All kinds of grunting and groaning noises in the back room, and it was weird. He was letting us stay there rent-free though, so whatever. Eventually, my boyfriend got back, and the guy came back out. He was hanging out like nothing was going on. I was a little weirded out, but when I went for a walk with my boyfriend and told him about it, he didn't seem too worried. The next day, the same thing happened. My boyfriend left to look for a job, and I was in the house alone with that creeper roommate. I was sitting in the living room, playing cards and listening to the radio again, like before. And just like the day before, he came out and drank for a while, staring at me. Then he said something about taking a nap. This time I heard the same thing again, and he started saying my name really loudly. I was way weirded out at this point, but like before, my boyfriend came back, and he quieted down. We went for a walk. I told him about it again, and he said he thought it was weird, but still figured the guy was harmless. The next day, same routine happened. My boyfriend left to look for work. I was sitting in the living room playing cards on the couch, and the creeper came out and started drinking again. This time he started talking to me. It was a really awkward conversation about what had been going on each day. I was really uncomfortable, so I walked outside to wait for my boyfriend to get home. When he did, I told him about it again. This time, he suggested we go pick up my dog from my mom's house. The dog I had at the time was a little Pomeranian-looking thing, and he was very aggressive. At least it was something. That night, we walked to my mom's house and picked up the dog. The next day, my boyfriend was staying at his friend's house overnight to help him move, and left me there alone. Really bad decision. Since I knew he wouldn't be there that night, I decided to chill in our bedroom with the dog instead of hanging out in the living room. I took a nap early in the day when the guy would be at work because I was pretty sure I wouldn't be sleeping that night. Since the curtain doors didn't close all the way, I locked my dog in his crate and lay down under the sheet to nap. Next thing I knew, I woke up and my dog was going absolutely insane. He was barking, growling, and snarling inside the cage. I kind of turned just enough to see the door to the room without making it obvious that I was awake. The guy was standing there in the doorway. I was completely freaking out at this point because there was no real way out of this room. If he wanted to, he could come in and do whatever he wanted to me. I didn't really have anything to defend myself with, except a 10-pound dog. I acted like I was still asleep and kind of rolled over where he couldn't see me, but I could see the door. He opened the door wider so he could still watch me. I was freaking out at this point. I sat up and scooted into the corner, where he'd actually have to come into the room to see me. I asked him, "Can I help you with something?" He made some kind of a weird noise and wandered off down the hallway. I got up, got my dog's leash, and decided I was getting out of that house. By the time I got into the living room to leave, he was sitting on the couch staring at me again. Then he started talking again.
So, I don't think this is working out. You and your boyfriend should probably find somewhere else to live.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. I'll tell him when he gets back, and we'll figure something out. I'm just gonna take the dog for a walk now. I decided I was gonna walk a few miles to my boyfriend's buddy's house, because there was no way in hell I was staying in that creeper's house alone again. I left, and the guy just kinda stared after me, but I figured that wouldn't be the end of it, and I would likely see him again. I headed off down the road, and about a half-mile away from the house, I heard his moped behind me. I figured he was going on a beer run or something. I just moved off to the side, so I wouldn't be in his way when he went by, but he pulled up beside me and started screaming at me. He said that I led him on. Then he said that we had until the end of the night to get out of his house. I honestly thought he was going to attack me or something, but after about 10 minutes of yelling, he just hopped onto his moped and drove away. I booked it out of there. By this time, it was pretty late, around midnight. It was pitch black since it was kind of a rural area. There were no streetlights or anything most of the way to my boyfriend's friend's house. I didn't even think to grab my stuff when I left. I just went straight there, which was a good 6 to 8 miles away. Fast forward a couple of days, and we got a ride back to the guy's house to pick up our stuff while he was at work. He said he left it on the porch. When we got there to get it, all my underwear was missing, and some of my other clothes were cut up. It was the creepiest thing I'd ever seen, and we just threw away most of it. We found out later that apparently the guy was known around the place as Uncle Perv, because he'd gotten in trouble a few years back for doing the same kind of thing to someone else. When I was in college, I lived with my 2 good friends in a shared apartment. We were very close and always had a great time. I would have liked to keep things the way they were after we graduated, but as things go, we all went our separate ways. I managed to find a job in the same city where we were living, but my 2 roommates both moved away. Because of that, I had to move out of our place since the rent would be too much. I also thought it would be easier to move, rather than find 2 new roommates. In the month or so leading up to the end of our lease, I was searching online for rooms to rent. There were a few decent-looking options right away. I couldn't afford a full apartment at that time, so I was looking for at least 1 roommate. Deep down, I was hoping that things would be similar to the way they were. Maybe I could find somebody that would become a good friend. As you might have already guessed, that didn't happen. There was one ad from Craigslist that seemed promising. It was a whole house to be shared with just one other guy, who was the owner. His name was Greg, and judging by his picture, he seemed to be in his early 30s. I was 23 at the time, so a bit of an age difference, but nothing too concerning. The house was about a 10-minute drive from my work, so it was the best option I had found so far. The rent was also on the cheaper side. Another advantage was that there was no commitment up front. The lease would be month to month right from the start. For those reasons, I called and set up a meeting. When I got there, the place looked much like the pictures. It was a basic house with 3 bedrooms and an unfinished basement. It was semi-detached and made of red brick. The neighborhood was a little rough. Most of the houses looked run down, but Greg's was one of the better looking. The second bedroom was Greg's office. It would be just the 2 of us staying there. I agreed to take it on the spot and paid my first and last month's rent right there. I had another 2 weeks at my old place, so I gradually moved over. After I moved in, the first few days were fine. Greg was alright. He showed me around and even helped me unpack. My room was small, and it was at the front of the house. There was a window that faced the neighbor, so it was not much of a view, just a brick wall. Greg had installed a heavy door with a solid lock, which I really appreciated. Since I didn't know him, it was good to have that extra kind of security. The first red flag came a few weeks into my stay. Like I said, Greg was alright, but when I met his friends, my opinion changed. He had some people over on a Friday night. I was out with some friends until late, but when I got back, there were 5 or 6 guys hanging out in the living room, smoking, drinking, and probably doing some other stuff, although I didn't see for sure. When I walked in the front door, I don't think they even saw me. They were that out of it. I'm no Boy Scout. I party a bit, but these guys were off their heads on something. It's a very uncomfortable thing to come home to. When I went to my room that night, I felt like something was off. I felt like somebody had been in there. I thought my laptop was on my bed, but I found it on my desk instead. When I turned it on to watch a movie before bed, I was surprised to see that it was already on. It was weird, because I always turned it off. My door was locked while I was out though, so I thought it wasn't possible for someone to get in. When I went to sleep that night, I tried to push it from my mind. After that night, I was distant from Greg, and especially his friends. It was beginning to seem like things might not work out because of how suspicious I was. I wasn't sure what was going on, or if it was all in my head, but I really felt that somebody was in my room that night when I was away. The next weekend, the same group of guys were over drinking. I stayed in that night, and I barely came out of my room. I went to bed at around 11, but lay awake for a long time, listening to the muffled conversation in the living room. By 1 a.m., I was still awake lying quietly in my bed, and Greg's friends were still there. I could still hear them talking, but the conversation seemed to have lowered to a whisper. Maybe they were trying to be respectful, I thought. Then I heard someone get up and walk towards my door. They stopped right in front of it. I lay there still, not sure what was going to happen next. As always, I had locked my door from the inside. I could see the shadow of 2 feet under the bottom crack of my door. Then suddenly, my doorknob shook. Whoever it was tried to open it. After a few heavy attempts at turning the knob, I heard something that still shakes me up to this day. I heard a key slide into the lock, then it turned, and the door opened. At that point, I jumped up from my bed shouting, "What the F?" over and over again. I ran over to the door and slammed it closed. Then I re-locked it and pressed my body up against it. Sitting on the floor shaking, I shouted out that I was calling the police. Greg answered, trying to explain it away with some grade A BS. He said they were worried about me and wanted to check if I was okay. I didn't buy that for a second. The guy had a spare key to my room that whole time. Who knows what he was doing in there when I was away. I had no choice but to stay there that night, but I didn't go back to bed. I stayed up all night sitting against the door. In the morning, I called one of my friends from school, who lived across town. He agreed to let me stay with him until I found my own place. I started packing up as soon as the sun came up, and I was out of there before noon. When I was on my way out the door, Greg tried one last time to talk me out of calling the cops. I was still kind of scared, so I told him that I wouldn't. I just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. Later that day, I did call the cops. My understanding is that they interviewed Greg, but there wasn't much they could do since it was my word against his. He got away with it, unfortunately. One thing that confused me about this is that I didn't know what they wanted in my room. I was a broke recent graduate, and I didn't have anything valuable. Greg would have known that, since he helped me unpack and move in. It wasn't until days later that I found out what was really going on. I was browsing my computer when something popped up in my browser. I noticed in my browsing history a credit card application that I didn't remember filling out. I was sure that it was Greg or one of his friends. How he got the password from my computer, I may never know. My guess is that Greg peeked at it when I was filling it in one time. I've also considered that there were hidden cameras in my room. I wouldn't put anything past that guy. He was another level of deviant, keeping a key to my room. Upon further investigation, there were 2 other credit card applications. I was able to cancel all of them, and I reported it all to the police. Again, it was my word against theirs, so they never got the justice they deserved. About 10 years ago, my girlfriend, now wife, lived in a house with roommates. It was an old 2-story house that was red brick. The whole neighborhood was like that, and I think the houses there were over 100 years old. The walls were painted a pale blue, and it seemed outdated. The wooden floors were old, and creaked in many spots. The house was divided by room, and each room was rented out separately. Therefore, her roommates didn't know each other beforehand. It really was a random group of people who lived there. They shared the common areas, a modest kitchen, and 2 bathrooms. Each room had its own lock on the door, a solid-looking deadbolt. I remember thinking that was a nice feature for the place, just an added bit of security. One of Tracy's roommates was Jack. He was an older guy, probably in his late 50s. He was nice enough whenever I saw him. He was quiet and seemed to keep to himself. There was nothing about him that alarmed me at first, other than that it was strange for an older guy to live in a house like that. The other roommates were young people, just getting on their feet. His room was right next to Tracy's, only separated by a thin wall. Sound traveled well in that house, but Jack was generally very quiet, so it wasn't a problem at first. One night at around midnight, I was staying over, and we heard weird noises coming from Jack's room, loud thuds and groans. That was not like him, so we were worried right away. We thought he might be sick or something, so we went to check on him. I knocked on his door, but as soon as I did, the noises just stopped. I stopped knocking right away, but I was still worried. I wanted to check on him, but Tracy thought we should leave him alone. I gave in, and we went to sleep. The next morning, we were relieved to see that Jack was okay. I passed him in the kitchen, and we talked for a few minutes. I thought he might have been having a heart attack, so I was happy to see him. I spent the night again the following week. Before we went to bed, Tracy told me that the noises from Jack's room had been happening almost every night since then. She was starting to get used to it. Sure enough, the same strange noises happened again that night. This time they were louder and even more intense. Tracy told me to ignore it, but I couldn't believe that it was normal. It sounded like he was dying, and I was terrified. I went to knock on Jack's door again, but when I walked towards it, the door flew open and hit me in the face. I stumbled back and slammed into the wall. I almost fell, but I caught myself just in time. When I looked up, I saw Jack standing there in the doorway. He was grunting like a maniac, and every few seconds he would stomp his foot on the ground, but I didn't know why. What really scared me, though, was that he was holding a knife. It looked like one of the large knives from the kitchen. He walked towards me in a weird, stiff way. I was still dazed from the hit, so it took me a while to react. But after a few seconds, I ran back into my girlfriend's room, and we locked the door. We could hear Jack hitting it for a while, but the door was strong, and the lock held. It went on for about 5 minutes, and then it stopped. We sat up talking quietly for a long time afterwards, and we decided not to call the police right away. We decided to give Jack a chance to explain himself. That behavior was totally unlike him, and we thought it might have been some kind of sleepwalking or night terror incident. We eventually fell asleep, but it was really late by then. The next morning, we woke up and heard someone in the kitchen. There were other roommates, but Tracy thought it was Jack. I was nervous, but got up and opened the door. In the kitchen, we saw Jack making breakfast as if nothing even happened. I walked over to him carefully and told him what took place the night before. He turned really red and said sorry a lot. He explained that he suffers from severe sleepwalking, but never thought it had gotten violent. I told him every detail, and even showed him the bump on my head from the door. When I did that, he literally started crying. I wanted to tell him that it was okay, but the truth is that it wasn't. I don't know for sure if he would have done something to me, but that's what it looked like. Tracy and I went out for the day, and we never saw Jack again. He moved out before we came back. His room stayed empty for a while, and the house went back to normal, but we always remembered that night. Tracy and I tried to look up Jack later, but never found out where he went. I like to think that he went to get help for his condition, and that's what I think he did. Tracy and I moved out about 6 months later. By that time, a new person had moved into Jack's room. We never told him what happened in that room, because we wanted to put it behind us. When we left that house for good, I was happy, because I didn't want to remember that scary night anymore. This happened in my very first year of college. I lived in the on-campus residence, and the way my floor worked, everybody had a roommate. The rooms were pretty big though, so I thought it wouldn't be so bad at first. My roommate was Jason, and he was the kind of person who could suck the energy out of any room. He spent most of his time hunched over his laptop playing video games. To the others on our floor, he practically didn't exist, because he barely ever went out and didn't even introduce himself to most of the other people. At first, I did try to be welcoming. During the first week, I made friends with most of the other people on my floor. I'm the extroverted type, so it's easy for me to make friends. Jason was clearly the opposite and struggled. I would constantly invite him to hang out with the others, but he said no every single time. Eventually, I got frustrated and stopped. Our room was like a big square, with our beds on opposite sides. We also had a desk next to our beds. Mine was right next to the window, while Jason's was opposite the door. When I walked into the room, I would see him from behind at his desk. I remember walking into our room one day just to get something. I found him in his usual spot at his desk. He was on his laptop as usual, and didn't even bother to turn around when I walked into the room. This is what things were like for the first month or so of my college experience. It was a tense situation for me. I tried to avoid spending time in my room because of that. After a while, I would only go into our room to sleep. As soon as I woke up in the morning, I would leave and not come back until midnight, or maybe even later. Even when I came in late, Jason would always be on his laptop. It seemed like he never slept, or maybe he was sleeping during the day when I was out. I didn't know, and didn't care. One night, I was trying to sleep, but I couldn't. I was laying awake for about 3 hours, and it was the middle of the night. The whole time, I was hearing key clicks from Jason's laptop. I opened my eyes and looked up to the ceiling, but I could see Jason in my peripheral vision. Every once in a while, he would look over to me, and then look back to his laptop. I was hardly moving, so I didn't know what drew his attention. Eventually, I must have drifted off to sleep though, and I got out of the room as soon as I woke up. About a month later, a friend sent me a link to a website. It was a forum, similar to Reddit, but less known. I had never heard of it. I clicked through, and what I found shocked me. There were pictures of me in our dorm room, some while I was asleep. They were all taken from different angles, and even more shocking, there was one taken of me in the shower. Luckily, you couldn't see much, but still. It was a huge invasion of my privacy, and I knew Jason was behind it. I immediately told our floor supervisor. He was as shocked as I was, and called resident services right there in front of me. I could hear a woman on the other line, and she sounded annoyed, like it was a nuisance to her. Maybe she didn't understand, or she didn't believe it. My floor supervisor convinced her to find me a new room anyway. However, I had to spend 2 more nights in that room with Jason. The thought alone made my skin crawl. I tried to find another place to stay, but there was nowhere else. I was stuck with Jason, horrible as it was. As far as I know, nobody even told Jason what was happening. He didn't even know that I knew. That night I lay in bed restless and uneasy. The room was dark, save for the faint light from Jason's laptop. Hours ticked by. Then in the dead of night, I woke up abruptly. I had a sense that I was being watched. I turned my head slightly and saw Jason. He was sitting up in his bed, his eyes fixed on me. In his hand, I could see the faint outline of his phone, aimed in my direction. He must have thought I was asleep. I lay still as I watched him take a picture. Right then, I got really angry. I threw off my covers and flipped on the light. The sudden brightness seemed to startle him, but only for a moment. I yelled at him, screaming in his face. I couldn't control myself. His response was a mumbled excuse. I don't even remember what he said. I lunged for his phone, but he pulled it away and rolled over on his bed. Then Jason pulled out a knife. I didn't see where he got it from, but it must have been next to his bed. It was just a regular pocket knife, not anything big, but still scary. I took a step back, but not before the blade sliced my arm. That wasn't enough to stop me, though. I managed to wrestle the knife away from him. The fight was messy, and I was bleeding. I landed several big punches to Jason's face, messing him up pretty bad. I'm not a fighter, and had never done that before, but in the heat of the moment, I simply lost it on him. It's not something I'm proud of, but it did feel good at the time. One of our neighbors must have heard the commotion and called campus security. They burst into the room, and Jason was taken away. Despite my injuries and the circumstances, I was kicked out of the residence system. The reason given was violence, regardless of the context or provocation. Apparently they had a zero-tolerance policy for that. Although I was out of the residence, I wasn't kicked out of school. That just meant I needed to find my own apartment off campus. Without a job or any source of income, that was tough. Luckily, my parents were willing to co-sign for me on a lease. I found a small, somewhat run-down apartment. It was better than dropping out. The room was bare, and the walls needed paint. The carpet was worn and thin in places. Life outside the campus bubble was different. I missed my friends and the party, but I was seriously relieved to be away from Jason. After I graduated, I found an internship in my field of study. It was in the city, and I was living with my parents at the time in the suburbs. The commute would have been over an hour each way, so I decided to find my own place. I started checking Craigslist for rooms to rent. My budget was low, so getting my own apartment was not an option. One of the only places that I could afford was a room in a basement apartment with a single roommate. It wasn't much, but it was close to the bus stop, and it was only a single bus to my work. I sent a message to the landlord, and we set up a time to do a viewing. It was a typical house, nothing remarkable about it from the outside. The landlord was a middle-aged man who seemed nice. He met me there, and led me into the house and to the basement. There were electronic locks on the doors, and it seemed clean. It had the basics, a bed, a small desk, and a window that let in just a bit of light. The landlord mentioned a roommate, but he wasn't around at the time. He told me that his name was Tim. His door was right next to mine, and it was closed. I took the room on the spot. My internship began in less than a week, and I was getting desperate. The landlord wanted first and last month up front, so I gave it to him. I moved in the next day. There wasn't much to it because the room was already furnished. When I walked down the stairs, I could tell that Tim was home because I could hear him in his room. Once I was settled in, I went to his door and knocked, just to introduce myself. To my surprise, he didn't even answer the door, just ignored me completely. I stood there like an idiot for a few minutes, and then I gave up. After that, I was feeling creeped out. I knew he was in there. I could even hear him in my room after I went there. My internship started soon after, and I wasn't home very much. After my first week, I still hadn't seen Tim. On the first weekend, I finally met him. It was a brief encounter in the kitchen. He was taller than me, and probably in his late 20s or early 30s. I said hi, but he just nodded and grunted at me. It was really weird. I had a friend over at the time, so we just went back into my room and tried to forget it. Our interactions, if they could even be called that, were sparse. We seemed to operate on opposite schedules. I'd hear the soft closing of his door at night as I was settled into bed, or the faint sound of footsteps in the morning as I was preparing for work. It seemed that he was intentionally trying to avoid me. Up until that point, there was nothing to be really worried about. I was uncomfortable, but it was nothing more than that. That is until the following incident. It was a typical evening. I had returned from work, and I was tired. I went to the bathroom to shower before turning in for the night. Before I turned on the shower, I heard Tim's door open. I then got in, and since I was in the shower, I didn't hear anything else. When I was done, I came out of the bathroom and went back to my room. I sat on my bed and opened my laptop to watch something. That's when I heard a strange noise. It was the unmistakable chime of a message notification from a phone. But it wasn't from my phone. I always kept mine on vibrate, so I knew it couldn't be mine. I didn't know exactly where it was coming from, but it was definitely in my room. At first, I thought a friend might have left his phone by mistake, strange as that seems. I took a quick look around the room to find the phone. Eventually, I looked under the bed. There he was, my roommate Tim, lying flat on his back, phone in hand. He looked right at me. I stumbled back when I saw him. I hit the door and the knob stuck into my back. I almost fell to the ground, but I caught myself before that happened. Thinking quickly, I ran over to my bed and grabbed my laptop. Then I ran out of the room and slammed the door. I took the bus to my parents' house that night and never went back to that house. After consulting with my mom, I decided not to even go back for my stuff. I made it out with my laptop, and there wasn't anything else valuable. The next day, I spoke to the landlord. I told him what happened, almost crying while I explained it. He had a strange reaction. Didn't seem particularly surprised. For some reason, I thought he might have known that Tim was a creep. Maybe it wasn't the first time something like that happened. In any case, I told him that if he got my stuff from the house and gave me back my last month's rent, then I wouldn't call the cops. I kept that promise, but I did post an ad on Craigslist to warn others about what I went through. Maybe I should have called the police too, but I never did. It was lucky that he happened to get a message while I was down there, because otherwise I never would have known. I might have gone to sleep with that creep down there, and if that happened, then he could have done anything he wanted to me. As soon as I could afford to do so, I bought my first house. I was only a few years out of college, but I was making decent money. Since I lived with my parents up until then, I had a lot of savings too. That was enough to get a small one-story house in my town. It had 2 bedrooms upstairs and 1 in the basement. The basement was not quite a separate apartment, but it did have its own bathroom and a small kitchen area. To offset the mortgage, I decided to rent out the basement. That's how I met Vince. He answered my posting on Facebook Marketplace. Vince was in his 40s, and he was very quiet. I remember our first meeting. Vince arrived at my house on a Sunday afternoon. I showed him around for a few minutes. There wasn't much to see. The deal was that the whole basement would be his, but he could come up to use the kitchen if he wanted. He agreed to rent the basement on the spot, and added that the small kitchen in the basement was fine with him. I thought that was a good arrangement. We would have our own space in the house. He moved in the next week. I helped him a little, but after he was moved in, I hardly saw him at all. However, I knew he was there almost all the time because I could hear the TV, or maybe it was video games. It wasn't loud or anything, but enough that I knew he was there. I didn't know much about him, but that suited me just fine. I had my life and he had his. We were just 2 people sharing a house, nothing more. I wouldn't say that we ever became friends. One day, Vince came upstairs. That was unusual. In fact, I think it was the first time it had ever happened. We stood in the kitchen together. He was looking at the floor. I stood there awkwardly, and then finally asked him what was going on. He asked me about the water pressure. He said he thought it seemed weak. A random seeming question at the time. I told him that everything was fine as far as I knew. He agreed timidly, and then went back downstairs. I was relieved when he finally left. A few days after that odd interaction, I noticed something strange. The plumbing was acting up, water was draining slowly. I thought of Vince when that happened. It wasn't exactly the water pressure, but it was plumbing related. There was a gurgle from the pipes, hinting at some kind of blockage. I called a plumber right away, not wanting it to get worse. When the plumber arrived, I showed him the problem in the sink upstairs. I know very little about plumbing, so after that, he took over. I left him alone to investigate. After about 10 minutes, the plumber told me he needed to access one of the pipes in the basement, so I went down and told Vince what was happening. As soon as I did, Vince was noticeably nervous. The plumber went down, and I went back upstairs. About 15 minutes later, he came back up to where I was waiting in the living room. The first thing he said to me was that we needed to call the police right away. I hesitated because I wanted more details. Then the man told me that he thought the pipes were clogged with a human body. He explained to me that he pulled out a handful of human hair and what looked like skin. The smell was beyond belief. Officers arrived at my house, and I showed them to the basement. The plumber went back down to show what he found. All the while, Vince was in his room with the door open. I could see him pacing back and forth, staring at the floor. By that time, I thought he was some kind of sociopath. With one look into the pipe, the police turned away in disgust. One of them went to talk to Vince. When confronted, he confessed immediately. He had killed someone. His demeanor was chilling, almost jovial. It was like he was a child caught stealing a cookie. I think I even heard the words, "You got me," then a laugh. I almost got sick. I watched as Vince was escorted out of the house in handcuffs. My basement had become a crime scene, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't live there anymore. That night, I moved back in with my parents. The police were there for weeks collecting evidence and recovering the remains. We later found out that there were 2 victims, and Vince had tried to dispose of them through the toilet in the basement. How he did all of that without me noticing, I may never understand. I never went back to that place, and I ended up selling it for pennies on the dollar. Nobody wants to live in a house like that. Not only the creepiness of it, but there are people out there who are fascinated by things like that, and houses like mine become a target. I drove by the property about a year later, and the house was demolished. A year after that, it was a parking lot for a small apartment building which was next door. That's probably the best use for a place like that. I don't know who would have wanted to live there. This happened just last year when I was 32. I had gotten married when I was 27, and it was good for the first year or two, but it was basically over after our 4th anniversary. We were little more than roommates after that. Being the guy, I was expected to move out of our house. However, after the legal costs and the bank took their part, there was not much left anyway, so my ex was out on her own soon enough as well. To add insult to injury, my company was laying people off at around that time, and I thought I was going to get fired in the next round. Because of that, I was thinking of moving back with my parents for a while, and didn't want to commit to a year lease. I didn't want to let the job go though, just in case they didn't can me, so I went for a short-term place while things were getting sorted out. Being in my 30s, I never thought I would end up in a shared house again, but that is what happened. I answered an ad on Craigslist and went to see the place. A nice older guy showed me the room, which had its own bathroom and quite a lot of space. It was $800 for the month, which was cheap for my city. I took it on the spot and handed him a bank draft for the full amount. He said I could renew on a month-to-month basis. I moved in later that week with just a suitcase full of my stuff. I had some other things in storage. On my first night, I met a couple who had recently moved to the country from Germany. They lived in the large room upstairs, while I was on the main floor. They were in their early 20s, and they seemed so enthusiastic about the future, kind of the opposite of me at the time. I was bitter and jaded, but trying to hide it from my new housemates. We had dinner together at the kitchen table. The couple made pasta and were kind enough to share with me. They told me they were moving out soon, even though they had only been in the house for a few weeks before me. I asked why, and they reluctantly told me that it was because of a fight with another of the people that lived there. They tried to be polite about it, but it was clear they were shaken. They said the man lived in the basement and was difficult to deal with. They didn't go into detail, but it was obvious that they were rattled. The German couple took off for bed early, and I went to my room by around 9 o'clock as well. A few days later, the couple was gone, and someone else had moved in already, but I just met him in passing. I didn't meet the guy in the basement until about a week later. I was in the kitchen upstairs and he walked in. At that moment, I knew that he must be the guy that the couple told me about, but I tried to pretend that they hadn't said anything. I tried to be polite and introduce myself. His name was Jim, and he was 25 years old. He was thin and had a patchy beard that looked messy, like he just didn't bother to clean it up. When we spoke, he seemed awkward, like he hadn't talked to anyone in a long time. I asked him what he did for work, but he avoided the question. After an uncomfortable 5 minutes, he went back downstairs. It was weird, but if that was all the couple was creeped out about, then I would have said they were overreacting. At that moment, I just thought he was a little weird, but it got much worse. The following week was fairly normal. It was boring at work, but I was happy that I still had a job. I tried to settle into my new routine, and kept mostly to myself. The house was quiet, and I didn't see much of the other people, because I stayed in my room most of the time. Then one night, everything changed. I was sitting in my room, reading a book, when I heard a knock at my bedroom door. I wasn't going to answer it, but then I heard a voice saying that it was the police. I walked over to the door and opened it just enough to see who was there. Sure enough, there were 2 uniformed officers standing right outside my room. I hadn't even heard them come into the house. I guess I wouldn't have noticed since other people lived there. One of the police told me that they were investigating a possible robbery. I soon found out that Jim had accused me. I was obviously shocked, because I would never do that. I had barely spoken to the guy, let alone stolen anything from him. The officers asked if they could search my room. I agreed out of instinct, even though I know now that it is better to refuse. At the time, I was thinking it would make me look guilty not to let them, but they can't use that against you anyway. Regardless, I let them check, thinking that I had nothing to hide. To my shock, they found Jim's wallet and a few other items in my closet. I couldn't believe it. I knew he must have planted them there. After the police left, I was furious and scared. I had no idea what that guy was up to. Against my better judgment, I decided to confront him the next day. When I went to the basement, he wasn't there. His room was locked, and I could hear faint music playing from inside. I knew that he left it playing pretty much all the time, even when he wasn't home. I banged on the door anyway, but there was no answer. I went back to my room and locked my door, feeling worried about what might happen next. Over the next few days, I avoided Jim and tried to stay out of the house as much as possible. I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. One night, I woke up to a noise. It was past midnight, and the house was silent, except for the sound coming from my door. I realized someone was trying to break into my room. I quietly got out of bed and grabbed a heavy book to use as a weapon, because I couldn't find anything better. I went to the door and pressed my ear against it. There was definitely someone fiddling with the lock. I flung the door open, and sure enough, it was him. Jim jumped back, clearly startled. He tried to play dumb and made some nonsense excuse, but we both knew that he was trying to get into my room, probably to plant evidence for his next scam. I told him to get out and never come near my room again. He mumbled an apology and went downstairs. I locked the door and stayed awake for a while, listening for any more signs of him. The next morning, I called the landlord and explained what happened, but he seemed indifferent, saying there was little he could do. I began looking for a new place to live, checking ads online, and asking around at work. A few days later, I was sitting in the living room when Jim came upstairs. He tried to act like nothing had happened, but I ignored him. He hovered for a moment, then went to the kitchen. Right then, I took the opportunity to leave the house. I returned later that evening to find Jim waiting for me in the hallway. He looked more disheveled than usual, and his eyes were bloodshot. It didn't take long before he started screaming at me. He accused me of trying to turn everyone in the house against him. I tried to ignore him and get to my room, but I had to walk right by him. As soon as I was close, he lunged at me and grabbed me by the back of my neck. I dodged and managed to push him away, then ran to my room and locked the door. I called the police, reporting the assault. There wasn't anybody else there at the time, though, so I didn't have any witnesses. However, when the police came, he admitted to what he did, or at least enough of it for them to arrest him. This time, the cops took Jim into custody. He wasn't at the house again for at least a week, because that was when I moved out. I had only paid for 1 month up front, so when that was up, I simply found another place. Luckily, I was never fired from my job, and I ended up getting a decent apartment a few months later. Hopefully, I'll never have to live with roommates again. To start off, I am a 27-year-old guy. I graduated from college a few years ago, but this happened in my first year when I lived on campus. For those that don't know how it works, you apply for a spot in residence, and they automatically match you up with a roommate. You fill out a little form, so they can try to match you up with someone compatible, but I suspect that it is more or less random. I actually went as a mature student, since I took a few years off to save up money, so I was 21 in my first year. That might have been the only thing that they actually considered. My roommate was named Danny, and he was a punk rocker type of guy with spiked hair, and he always wore band t-shirts. He was also older like me. I think he was 22. He checked in before me, so he got the bed that was farther away from the door. When I walked in, he got up and we shook hands. He seemed nice, but after talking for a while, it seemed that we didn't have much in common. I was into reading and playing video games, while Danny was more about loud music and partying. One thing that really bothered me was that he smoked cigarettes, and the smell lingered in our room. I could tell that as soon as I walked in. The building had a no smoking policy, of course, but it came in on his clothes for sure. It wasn't something we fought about, but it did create some tension between us. We didn't hang out much together. I had made some friends on our floor, but Danny mostly kept to himself. It was about a month in, and most nights on the weekend, he would go out to party off campus, probably hitting some punk shows or something. All I really knew was that he would go out early and come back late, or sometimes not at all. If I had to guess, he only slept in our room about half the time, which I didn't mind since I had more space. He hadn't made any friends in the dorm, but he started hanging out with some guys who didn't go to our school. These guys looked like other punk rockers who he probably met at a concert or something. They would come around occasionally, but usually didn't stay long. One evening, however, I walked into our room to find 4 or 5 of these older guys hanging out, drinking beer, and one of them was even smoking a cigarette, although blowing it out the window. They were probably in their 30s, or maybe older. I said hi, and tried to hide how uncomfortable I was, but after less than 5 minutes, I went to one of my friend's rooms and stayed there until it was late. When I went back to my room that night at around 1, they were gone, and Danny didn't come back that day. The next night, however, he came in at 10 in the evening. We didn't talk much because I was on my computer studying. I did get a look at him though, and it seemed like he hadn't slept at all. If I had to guess, he was heavily into drinking and drugs. Actually, it was pretty obvious that he was. As time went on, Danny's new friends started coming around more often. I didn't understand why he was hanging out with these older guys, and I tried to avoid them as much as possible, spending more time in the library or with my friends on the floor. One time, Danny got a warning for bringing them into the dorm, and he had also been warned for smoking in the building. It was starting to seem like he might get kicked out. Horrible as it seems, I was kind of hoping he would. Not that I hated him or anything, but it was annoying having a roommate like that. There was another night when Danny and his friends were partying in our room again. I went in and hung out for a while, but I could tell that it wasn't my scene. There were no drugs or anything, but I got a bad vibe from one of his friends. I can't remember his name, but this guy must have been 35 years old and over 300 pounds. He was bald, with a jean vest and ripped jeans. At around 10 at night, I slipped away and went to one of my friend's rooms, as I often did in situations like that. I was right next door, so I could still hear them all night. Past midnight, I could hear our RA talking to them about the noise. It was a weeknight after all. They argued for a bit, but eventually I could hear them leaving. I went back to my room after that, and after airing it out for cigarette smoke, I went to bed. I didn't see Danny the next day, or the day after. It was still kind of normal for him to disappear for a couple days, but after about a week, I started to get worried. This was getting close to exams for the first semester of the year, so we had been roommates for a few months at the time. I asked around the dorm, but no one had seen him. I even tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I sent more than a few messages, but got no response. Eventually, I decided it was time to report him missing. I went to the campus security office and told them about Danny. I left the office feeling a bit guilty for not reporting it sooner, but I hoped Danny would just turn up soon with a reasonable explanation. After reporting it, campus security interviewed me a couple of times, asking about friends and the guys he'd been hanging out with. I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much. His friends on campus were scarce, and those older guys were a mystery. I never got to know them very well, and didn't even have a way to contact them at all. One night, I was in the common room with some friends when we saw a police car pull up outside the dorm from the window. A couple of officers came in and headed straight for the RA's room. I had a feeling this was about Danny. Later, the RA came to my room with the police officers. They asked me the same questions that campus security had. It was all just about the last time I saw him and who he was with. I repeated my answers, but the cops seemed to be interrogating me. It was like they didn't believe me or something, like I was holding something back. I guess they thought it was weird that I didn't know who my roommate's friends were. The officers left after a while, and we all started talking about it more. Some people thought he had run away. Others thought something horrible might have happened to him. No one really knew anything for sure, though. A couple of weeks went by with no word from Danny. The police stopped by a few more times, but never talked to me again. I guess I was ruled out somehow. The police believed Danny had been involved in something with those older guys. They did track them down eventually, but they didn't help. In my opinion, One or multiple of them must have had something to do with the disappearance. Whether it was an accident or otherwise, I am not sure, but they must know. We never got any answers though, and the year went by without my roommate. This is a scary story about a guy I used to know. We were kind of friends for a few years prior to this happening, but we weren't very close. I was in university, and I would see him around at parties sometimes. His name was Nick, and we always had a good time whenever he was around. I guess I felt like we were pretty good friends for a while, but we never really hung out other than that. I had a house with 3 friends back then. We rented the whole thing and split the rent evenly. With 4 of us, that was only $350 each, so pretty cheap. That's in $2006 though, so not quite the crazy deal that it might sound like now. It was an older house that was in rough shape. The floors were creaky and always dirty, even after we cleaned. It was so bad that we all wore shoes inside most of the time. It was not too far from campus, so it was a good place for us as students. One night, I was out at a bar with 2 of my roommates and another friend. We saw Nick there, and he pulled up a chair to our table. After talking for a while, he mentioned that he needed a place to stay. He was living in an apartment by himself at the time, but he couldn't afford it anymore, so he had to move out. When we left the bar that night, me and my roommate Sean were talking while we walked home. He mentioned that we had a spare room in our house that might make a decent bedroom. It was really just a large closet that was awkwardly placed next to the living room. It would have been barely big enough to fit a single bed. Sean thought it would be cool to have Nick move in though, and I agreed. After some discussion, we decided to ask him to move in. He came by to look at the room, which we had cleared out already. It looked surprisingly big when all the junk was removed. It did have a light and an electric socket, but no window. When he saw it, he agreed to take it on the spot. He probably didn't have much choice anyway. Nick moving in seemed like a good idea at first. We all saved a bit of money on rent, and having another person around seemed like it would be fun. Nick was easygoing, and we all got along pretty well. We would hang out together, watch movies, and sometimes make dinner as a group in the evenings. For a while, everything seemed to be going well. One thing to mention about him, though, was that he was a smoker, and I don't mean cigarettes. We were college kids back then, and smoking was quite popular. One of my other roommates was pretty into it as well, so it didn't seem like a huge deal, but Nick was basically always smoking. I didn't even know where he was getting the money for it all. It would have been expensive the way he was going. It was a few weeks before anything really happened. I came home one afternoon after an early morning class. When I walked up to the front door, I saw that the mail had come in. It was almost always junk mail, but sometimes there would be some coupons that I would use, so I grabbed it from the box and went into the house. I sat down at the coffee table in the living room, then spread the mail out in front of me. Shockingly, there was an envelope that was addressed to me, and it was from Capital One, the credit card company. At first, I thought it was some promotion to get me to apply for a card, but when I opened it, there was a new credit card in there with my name on it. It seemed like a mistake, so I gave them a call. After waiting on hold forever, I was able to talk to someone. They assured me that I had applied for the card, but gave me the option to cancel it. I was still confused, but canceling still seemed like the best choice. When I hung up the phone, I sat there and thought about it for a few minutes. That was the first time that I started to suspect Nick. Living in the house, he would have been able to get a copy of most of my important documents when I wasn't around. It would be pretty crappy to accuse anybody without evidence, though, so I was torn. I talked to another of my roommates, hoping that there would be something else to go on, but I was the only one who got a mystery card in the mail. Over the next few days, some things began to go missing in the house as well. Sean thought there was some money missing from his room. We all began to suspect Nick, maybe because we didn't trust him as much, and because these things happened not that long after he moved in. When Nick came home that night, we confronted him in the living room. As soon as I accused him, he got really mad and started yelling. I was sitting on the couch and he came over, standing right over me. He kept telling me to stand up, but I knew that if I did, then there would be a fight. I didn't want that, so I stayed sitting. He leaned down and grabbed me by the shirt anyway, and tried to pull me up. He almost ripped it off of me before one of the other guys pulled him back. Then I saw him turn around and throw a punch at my roommate Andrew. As soon as he did that, the rest of us got involved. We took him down to the ground and held him for a while, then eventually let him up. He didn't get violent again, and we managed to get him out the door. I was scared that he would come back and trash the house, but that night, he didn't even come back. I still don't know where he stayed, but I was happy that he wasn't there. He did have a key though, so I was still nervous. We didn't see him for the next few days, not at school and not at the house. One night, when it was late, probably 3 a.m., I was struggling to fall asleep. That was when I heard the front door open. As soon as that sound hit my ears, I knew it was Nick. It couldn't have been anybody else. Before I knew it, footsteps could be heard coming up the stairs, then my bedroom door burst open, and Nick walked right in towards me. He came right up to my bed and grabbed me by the shoulder, then threw me to the floor. I was still conscious enough to scream for help. Within seconds, 2 of my other roommates came in to help me fight him off. They tackled him to the ground and held him down again. This time, I called the cops, something we should have done the first time. While the cops were there, I told them about the situation with the credit card. They didn't handle that stuff personally, but gave me the number for the financial crimes unit. Apparently credit card fraud is a pretty big deal, and when I called to report it, they were able to prove that it was Nick who applied. I don't know the details of that, but they were able to trace it somehow. At least with that, we had proof that it was him. That wasn't the end of it though. We still had to clean out what was left of his room. When we were emptying it out, there was a small plastic box that was kind of transparent. It was blue clear plastic. I opened it, and inside was what looked like several used needles and other drug paraphernalia. He spent some time in jail, but when he got out, he stayed away from us, and we never contacted him again. By the end of that semester, he had dropped out of school, and I think he moved away.